Hi everyone, welcome back to Rachel's studio, and I'm so excited about today's topic because it's a big one, and that is water control. So I'm going to whittle it down to 4 different tips in each of the 4 different places where you can control water, and that is on your paper, in your jar, with your brush, and on your palette. And don't forget, there is a bonus tip at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first place we're going to start is with paper. Paper is really important because if you don't use good watercolor paper, then it's going to be so much harder to control your water. And if you are a beginner, I recommend using cold press. And hot press is so much harder to control your water with because if you just use a little bit too much water or you let your paint dry out a little too much, then you get these really awkward brush strokes and it starts getting blotchy and yucky. So if you want to use the best paper, I think, for controlling your water and kind of having a paper that kind of covers up some of your mistakes, then I would recommend Arches Cold Press 100% cotton, 140 pound. And I say 140 pound because it's just cheaper than 300 pound. But what happens with Arches cold press paper, or really any 100% cotton cold press watercolor paper? It doesn't have to be Arches. Arches is one of the more expensive ones. And this, by the way, is my fluid watercolor paper that's made out of cellulose, and it's not 100% cotton. And I've gotten pretty good results on it, although it does buckle really badly. And that does present its own challenges, but it's good to practice on. There are other ones on the market that are acceptable. I'm just used to it, and Arches almost does the work for you of having your colors and your paint blend together smoothly, even if you don't have the perfect amount of water mixed up. So even for practice, I recommend using a good 100% cotton watercolor paper. Or there's also Bao Hung 100% cotton cold press watercolor paper, which you can buy on Amazon. That one's a lot cheaper and it's pretty good. And of course, there are tons of other really good 100% cotton cold pressed watercolor papers out there. So just experiment around and see what works best with your style. The next tip I have is to avoid puddles. And in this painting demonstration here, I'm working on this background of this woman, and I started getting too much water on my background. And if I would have left it like that, then I would have gotten uneven background. It wouldn't have been a smooth looking wash once it dried. So I went ahead and used some paper towel to sop up these puddles. So sop it up either with a paper towel or with a sponge or a wrung out dry brush. Here's another little demo I did of this dog, and I was painting the background, and I wanted all the colors to really softly blend and merge together. So I did use a lot of water here, but I did make sure that the water was evenly distributed across the whole background before I charged in the paint. I made sure there were no puddles before I charged in all these different colors to really make a beautiful and dynamic background that softly blended together. And now a word from our sponsors. If you enjoy this video and some of my other videos, please be sure to subscribe. Also, show me some YouTube algorithm love and leave me a comment, ask me a question like this video. If you would like to learn from me even more in depth, come check out my Patreon, where for just $5 you can get instant access to a library of free tutorials where you can watch me paint and explain as I go in real time so you can paint along with me. Plus, you get a downloadable traceable, a reference photo, and a supply list with each tutorial. So that leads me into my third tip that I have for controlling water at the paper level, and that is if you do get too much water on your paper, you can blot it up. As long as it's still wet, you can blot away. You can blot it up with a dried out brush, or a sponge, or paper towel. There's a zillion different things that you can use to blot water up, and you might just lay a piece of toilet paper on top of it and then lift it up to get a very even blot. There's a lot of different ways to blot, but like if you're doing a little detail in an eye and you have more water on your brush than you thought and you get like a blob in your eye, don't panic, just blot it up. As long as it's wet, you can blot up most colors. And that's also why I recommend not painting with staining colors like phthalo blue, sap green, alizarin crimson. Those are all really staining and they're a lot harder to blot up. My next tip is to avoid painting during the buckling stage what is the buckling stage? The buckling stage is when you're painting and your paper goes from glistening and the water starts absorbing into the paper. It's still quite damp, but because the water is absorbing into the paper, it's making the paper buckle. And when you push on your paper, like I do here in this little demonstration I did just for this video, it buckles up. And when you see your paper starting to do that, then you know that it's kind of a dangerous time if you don't want cauliflowers and blossoms. Now, for this painting that I'm showing you here of this peacock, I wanted to create blossoms to give a feathery texture in my peacock's feathers. So I actually used this to my advantage and used the buckling stage here to drop a little bit of water here and there to create some really interesting feather textures, but normally you don't want to do that. So here's another piece of paper. I've used phthalo blue cauliflowers a lot, and I'm painting with cream consistency paint just to demonstrate to you guys here that if you paint on buckling paper with cream consistency paint, you won't get cauliflowers. So it is possible to paint during the buckling stage. So the only way to paint onto buckling paper is either to have cream consistency paint, which is really thick and that will not cause cauliflowers, or just let it completely dry and don't mess with it. Just be warned, you got to be careful during the buckling stage. All right, that's it for paper. Shall we move on to the jar? How much of your brush do you dip into the water? Okay, so let me just give you an example. Say you want to mix up some cream consistency paint. You want to make a really dark mark. So what you would do is you would take a wrung out damp brush and dip just the tip into your jar. And then you would mix your paint. Or say you want milk consistencies, then you would dip your tip all the way to the belly and then use that watery brush to go to your palette and mix up some milk consistency. Say you wanted to do a big first glistening wash. When I want to do the underpainting with a bunch of tea consistency paint and I want to cover a large area, then I'll just stick that brush all the way down into the water, and then I have a ton of water on my brush. Another thing, this is tip number 4 for water control at the jar, and that is you're painting and you dip your tip in, you mix some paint, and then you've got a little too drippy of a brush. If you find that your brush is too drippy, but you still want a good amount of water in it, you can wipe it off on the side of the jar, and then you just have a medium amount of water in your brush, which a lot of times is just what you need. Kitty break. I love you. Now let's move on to how you can control water in your brush. Now we've talked a little bit about how you control water in your brush at the jar area, but there's a few more tips that I want to talk about that you can do with just your brush, and it doesn't involve the jar. So let's talk about those things. So tip number 1 is the kind of brush you use, whether it's synthetic or natural hair or a combination of the two. And what I have found is a happy medium is to have a brush that has both synthetic and natural hairs in it, like the silver black velvet brushes do. And a fully synthetic brush just doesn't hold enough water to really be able to get much work done. Now, sometimes synthetic brushes, I've found a few that I really like recently. They have a really great point and they're really good for doing little details like eyes, and they don't hold a lot of water, but they don't need to. They just need to hold some nice cream consistency paint and have a nice point, which they do. So synthetic brushes are really good because they are a little bit stiffer than all natural hair brushes, and they are considered to have more of a snap. And then natural hair brushes are known for having a really nice point and also holding a lot of water. And so when you combine the two characteristics of both of those into one brush, you really have the best of both worlds. So that's why I really love my silver black velvet brushes, because they have both synthetic and natural hairs in them. And what that does also in terms of water control is you can have a little bit of water in your brush or a lot of water in your brush or anything in between. So that just gives you so much more options when it comes to water control and how much water you have in your brush, how much water you mix with your paint. So let's do a little demonstration. I'm going to do a little contest between my silver black velvet brush here and a synthetic brush. What you're going to see is that the synthetic hair brush is going to run out of paint a lot faster. So that silver black velvet size 8 round on the right has so much more paint in it. And then I'm going to use this other brush that I just recently discovered and
test it out. Now, this is another synthetic brush, but this is a nicer synthetic brush, and it does a better job than that other one. So this is a Princeton Velvet Touch synthetic brush, and it really held a lot more water than the other synthetic brush. So you just have to kind of play around and with brushes and figure out what you really like. And so here I am using a fully synthetic brush. It has a beautiful tip. I love this brush. It's called a 4 long round, and I really like it. It's a brand new brush, and I had exquisite ability to control small details with this little brush. So there is a place for a synthetic brush, and that is when you're doing little details.
All right, another thing that I do with my brush when I'm painting, and say I need less water in my brush because I need to really control what I'm doing on the paper, like painting eyes or dry brush technique, and I just need a little bit of water in my brush, I'll squeeze it out. You'll see me do that all the time. I'll squeeze it out and then I'll pick up water, or say I made a mark, I realized it had too much water in the mark, and then I squeeze out my brush real fast and then I'll sop it back up with my brush, and my brush acts like a sponge. There's a zillion different ways that you will need to get water out of your brush. Don't leave, kitty. Do you really have to leave?
Another great way to control your water is just to have, like I have here, a paper towel or a sponge, and just have that to always blot your brush on. So if you have a little bit too much water in your brush, you can always just blot really quickly, and it just becomes second nature. So that's what I was doing here as I painted that. I needed a lot of control, especially when I was doing smaller detailed areas.
Another thing that I do if I really have a lot of water in my brush, I want a medium amount of water in my brush, but I have a large amount of water in my brush. What I'll do is I'll just take my brush, I am moving fast, I'm painting, I'm picking up paint, I'm painting, you know, it's a fast process, and I'll just shake my brush onto my palette to get 3 or 4 drops out of it, and then keep on going to get the excess water out of my brush. That was 4 ways to control water at the brush level. Now let's look at how to control water at the palette level. All right, so I'm just gonna start with the super basics, and I see this question all the time on watercolor forums. Beginners are asking, should I use tubes or pans? And my answer is always squirt tubes into your palette, let it dry overnight, and then the reason why I like that is when I go in with a damp brush or a medium wet brush or a very wet brush, I can rub it onto that paint and get just the right amount of paint to water ratio very quickly. Whereas if I'm working with a blob of fresh squeezed paint, I gotta work with that paint and get it non-gloppy and mix more water, and then it's too much, and it gets out of control really fast. So it's a lot easier to control your water to paint ratio if you paint with dried watercolor paint. And that segues very nicely right into how I like to paint with when I'm painting, for example, cream consistency paint. And if you follow me and you've watched any of my videos, you've seen a lot of shots of my palette that is full of dried, messy looking paint. And it's perfect because it's dry on the palette, but it's a thin layer. So it's very easy to go in with just a damp brush, reactivate it, and get cream consistency paint, and boom, perfect water control, because you don't have too much water in your paintbrush, and you can just go on your merry way without having to really think about water control at all. Another thing that I like to do before I even start my painting session, and this is tip number 3, is I spray my palette first. I'll sit down, I'm getting my art supplies together, getting everything laid out, and one of the first things that I do is I just mist the colors that I'm going to use, so that kind of activates them, so I don't have to scrub so hard with my paintbrush when, say, I want some cream consistency paint, because it's already somewhat activated, and that helps me control my water to paint ratio as well. Another thing that you can use, depending on how your palette is constructed, but my palette has these wells that they dip down, and so I will often put the paint on the edge of that, so when I mix with my brush, the water kind of runs down into the well. I don't have a big huge puddle sitting on top of my paint because I put the paint at the bottom of the well. Instead, I put the paint at the top of the well, so it never gets gloppy and covered up with water, and then it's a mess.
All right, are you all ready for my bonus tip? My bonus tip is addressing the other side of the spectrum, which is what happens when your paper gets too dry and you need it to stay wet in order to be able to keep working your painting. Because remember, when it starts to go into the buckling stage, you've really got to let it dry before you continue, but you can kind of cheat the system. If your painting is starting to get too dry, you can give it a little spritz or two. And that's exactly what I did here. I gave it a couple spritzes with a fine mist sprayer, and then I was able to continue to work on this mane and keep everything wet and workable.
All right, thank you so much for joining me on this little exploration of how to control your water with watercolor. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to check out my playlist, Watercolor Basics. I have a Fur series playlist. Now go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.